My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I was sitting in that sterile conference room watching my cousin Jessica laugh about my $1 inheritance when the notary cleared his throat and said there was one more document to read. What happened next didn't just change my life, it exposed 29 years of family lies and showed me that sometimes the people who love you most are the ones everyone else overlooks. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights in the Central Phoenix Library cast their usual harsh glow across the returns desk where I spent most of my days. It was a Tuesday morning in October, and I was processing a stack of overdue romance novels when my phone buzzed with a text from Uncle Tom. Eleanor's will reading today at 3 p.m. Robert Chen's office downtown. Be there. No pleasantries, no condolences. Just the cold efficiency that had defined most of our family interactions since I was a kid. I stared at the message for a long moment, my chest tightening with that familiar mix of grief and anxiety that had become my constant companion since Grandma Eleanor passed 2 weeks ago. The funeral had been a blur of expensive flower arrangements and distant relatives I barely recognized, all of them offering hollow condolences while shooting curious glances at my thrift store dress. Jessica had given the eulogy, speaking eloquently about a woman she'd visited maybe twice in the past year, while I sat in the back row, remembering the Sunday afternoons I'd spent with Eleanor, helping her tend to her garden and listening to her stories about the old days in Paradise Valley. My supervisor, Mrs. Rodriguez, found me in the break room an hour later, staring at my untouched sandwich. "Sarah, honey, you look like you've seen a ghost. Everything okay?" I explained about the will reading, and she immediately shooed me out the door. "Go on, take the rest of the day. These books aren't going anywhere, but family." Well, that's different. I drove my aging Honda Civic through the Phoenix traffic, the air conditioning struggling against the October heat that still hit 90 degrees. The law office was in one of those gleaming downtown towers that made me feel small and out of place. All marble floors and expensive suits rushing past with important papers. I found myself checking my reflection in the elevator mirrors, smoothing down my simple black dress that suddenly felt shabby compared to the polished professionals around me. Robert Chen's office was on the 15th floor, and I could see the valley stretching out below, dotted with red-tiled roofs and swimming pools that sparkled like jewels in the desert sun. The waiting area was decorated in muted browns and golds, with leather chairs that probably cost more than my monthly rent. I was early as usual and spent 10 minutes pretending to read a legal journal while fighting the urge to flee back to the safety of my small apartment in Tempe. Uncle Tom arrived precisely at 3, his silver hair perfectly styled and his suit pressed to knife-edge creases. He'd inherited his father's real estate empire and carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. Aunt Linda followed behind him, her designer handbag clutched like a shield, offering me a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. We'd never been close, but she'd always been civil in that distant way that wealthy people managed when dealing with their less fortunate relatives. Jessica made her entrance 5 minutes late, as she always did, her heels clicking against the marble floor with the kind of authority that came from years of corporate success. She was beautiful in that polished way that money could buy, her blonde hair styled in perfect waves, and her makeup flawless despite the Arizona heat. She hugged me briefly, the scent of her expensive perfume overwhelming, and I caught a glimpse of the diamond tennis bracelet that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. "Sarah, sweetie, how are you holding up?" she asked, her voice carrying that practiced sympathy that marketing executives perfected for difficult clients. Before I could answer, she was already turning to her parents, launching into a story about the traffic on the 101 and how her assistant had rescheduled 3 meetings so she could be here. I found myself studying her face, looking for any sign of the cousin who used to build blanket forts with me at Christmas. But that girl was long gone, replaced by this successful stranger who spoke in buzzwords and power poses. Robert Chen emerged from his office exactly at 3:15, a distinguished man in his 60s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He'd been handling our family's legal affairs for decades, and I remembered him from Eleanor's Christmas parties, always standing quietly in the corner with a glass of wine and a gentle smile. He guided us into his conference room, where copies of legal documents waited at each place setting like menus at a restaurant none of us had chosen to visit. The conference room felt too large for our small family, with its long mahogany table and oil paintings of desert landscapes. I took the seat nearest the window, partially hidden behind Uncle Tom's broad shoulders, and watched the late afternoon sun paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. Eleanor would have loved this view, I thought, remembering how she'd always insisted on watching the sunset from her back patio, even in her final weeks when walking was difficult. Robert began with the standard legal formalities, his voice steady and professional as he explained the probate process and the various technicalities that would govern the distribution of Eleanor's estate. I found myself drifting, thinking about the last time I'd seen her alive, just 3 days before she passed. She'd been sitting in her favorite chair in the sunroom, her once strong hands folded in her lap, and she'd looked at me with those sharp blue eyes and said, "Sarah, honey, you're the only one who sees me as more than a bank account." At the time, I'd thought she was just being dramatic, the way elderly people sometimes got when they were feeling lonely. The reading of the actual will brought me back to the present with jarring clarity. Eleanor's estate was substantial, built on decades of smart investments and her late husband's successful real estate ventures. The house in Paradise Valley, worth over $1 million, went to Uncle Tom. The stock portfolio, carefully managed and worth nearly another $1 million, was divided between Tom and Jessica. The jewelry collection, including the diamond necklace that had belonged to Eleanor's mother, went to Jessica. The vintage car collection, the furniture, the artwork, all of it distributed among family members who had the space and resources to appreciate such things. And then Robert's voice shifted slightly, and I heard my name. To my granddaughter Sarah Mitchell, who has shown me more kindness in recent years than I perhaps deserved, I leave the sum of $1, with the hope that she will understand this gesture is not a reflection of my love for her, but rather a symbol of something much more meaningful that she will discover in due time. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt my cheeks burn with humiliation as I processed the words, my mind struggling to understand how Eleanor could have left me nothing but a symbolic dollar. Jessica tried to cover her shocked laughter with a cough, but I caught the glance she exchanged with her mother, a look that said everything about what they thought of my place in the family hierarchy. Uncle Tom cleared his throat uncomfortably, and I realized that everyone in the room was waiting for me to react, to say something that would either gracefully accept this public dismissal or make the situation even more awkward. "Well," I managed to say, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. "I suppose that's that." I reached for my purse, ready to escape this room and these people who had just witnessed my grandmother's final judgment of my worth. 29 years of Sunday visits, of grocery runs and doctor appointments, of listening to her stories and helping her maintain her independence. And it had all been worth exactly $1. But Robert Chen wasn't finished. He was reaching into his briefcase, pulling out a sealed envelope that looked different from the other documents, heavier somehow, with my name written across it in Eleanor's distinctive handwriting. "There's one more item," he said, his voice taking on a tone I hadn't heard before, something almost apologetic. "Mrs. Mitchell left specific instructions that this document was to be opened only after the reading of the will, and only in the presence of all family members." Jessica had stopped laughing. Uncle Tom leaned forward in his chair, his businessman's instincts clearly sensing that something significant was about to happen. Aunt Linda's perfectly manicured fingers drummed against the table, and I found myself holding my breath as Robert carefully opened the envelope with a letter opener that caught the light streaming through the windows. Inside was a thick document, official-looking with embossed seals and foreign stamps that I couldn't immediately identify. Robert's eyebrows rose as he scanned the first page, and I watched his expression shift from professional neutrality to something approaching surprise. He looked up at me, then at Uncle Tom, then back at the document in his hands. "This appears to be a trust deed," he said slowly, "for an international trust established in Switzerland. The beneficiary is listed as—" He paused, double-checking the name, "Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell." The room erupted into chaos. Jessica's voice cut through the air like a blade. "What kind of trust? How much money are we talking about?" Uncle Tom was demanding to see the document, insisting there must be some mistake, while Aunt Linda clutched her purse tighter and muttered something about Eleanor's mental state in her final years. But I couldn't focus on any of their words because I was staring at Robert Chen's face, watching him read through page after page of legal text, his expression growing more incredulous with each paragraph. "The trust was established 15 years ago," he said finally, his voice cutting through the family's protests, "with an initial deposit of $2 million. According to these documents, it has been managed by a Swiss investment firm and has grown to prot." He paused, scanning the numbers again as if he couldn't believe what he was reading. "Approximately $8.5 million. Jessica's face went white. Uncle Tom's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Aunt Linda actually dropped her purse, and I heard the contents scatter across the marble floor. But I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't process what I was hearing. $8.5 million. The number was so large it didn't seem real, like something from a movie or a dream. "There's more," Robert continued, his voice growing stronger as he worked through the legal language. "The trust includes specific conditions for release of funds. The beneficiary must demonstrate, and I quote, a pattern of genuine care and kindness toward the grantor, without expectation of financial reward, as evidenced by regular visits and assistance with daily activities over a period of no less than 5 years." The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the awkward quiet of embarrassment or shock, but something deeper and more profound. I felt tears stinging my eyes as I realized what Eleanor had done, how she'd been watching and documenting every Sunday visit, every grocery run, every time I'd helped her to her doctor appointments, or simply sat with her on the patio watching the sunset. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She'd been building a case for my character, creating a paper trail of love that would stand up in any court. Jessica found her voice first, but it came out as a strangled whisper. "This can't be legal." She was old, she was confused. Sarah manipulated her, convinced her to do this. But even as she spoke, I could see the doubt in her eyes, the growing realization that her grandmother had been far more sharp and calculating than any of them had given her credit for. Uncle Tom was studying the documents now, his real estate lawyer's mind working through the implications. "When was this trust established?" he asked Robert, though I suspected he already knew the answer would complicate his daughter's accusations. "March 15, 2009, Robert replied. Mrs. Mitchell was 73 years old at the time, in excellent health, and according to the documentation here, she underwent a complete mental competency evaluation before establishing the trust. The Swiss firm has copies of all medical records confirming her sound mind and decision-making capacity." I thought back to 2009, trying to remember what had been happening in my life then. I'd been 23, fresh out of college and struggling to find my place in the world. That was around the time I'd started visiting Eleanor regularly, initially because I was lonely and she was always happy to see me, but gradually because I genuinely enjoyed her company. She'd been sharp and funny, full of stories about the early days of Phoenix development and the characters she'd met along the way. I'd never thought of those visits as anything more than spending time with someone I cared about. "The trust also includes provisions for immediate access to funds," Robert continued, "as well as detailed instructions for the transfer of assets. There's a letter here from the Swiss firm confirming that all conditions have been met and that the funds are ready for transfer upon presentation of proper identification and legal documentation." Jessica stood up so quickly her chair rocked backward. "This is insane. She left me jewelry and left Sarah $8 million? For what, visiting an old lady?" Her voice was rising, taking on the sharp edge that I remembered from childhood arguments. But there was something else there too, a desperation that made me realize how much she must have been counting on Eleanor's money. "The trust documentation is quite specific about the reasoning," Robert said, his voice taking on the patient tone of someone who dealt with many difficult family situations. Mrs. Mitchell wrote detailed letters each year, documenting her observations about family relationships and her reasoning for establishing the trust. She was particularly concerned about ensuring that her assets went to someone who valued people over possessions. Aunt Linda had recovered enough to speak, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. Eleanor always played favorites. This is just another one of her manipulations, trying to control us from beyond the grave. But I could see the calculations happening behind her eyes, the dawning realization that their expected inheritance had just evaporated. Uncle Tom was more measured in his response, his business mind already working through the legal implications. We'll contest this, of course. No court will uphold a trust that discriminates against family members based on such subjective criteria. But his voice lacked conviction, and I suspected he was already mentally reviewing his interactions with Eleanor over the past few years, remembering the missed holidays and forgotten birthdays. I finally found my voice, though it came out smaller than I intended. I don't understand. Why didn't she tell me? Why the dollar in the will if she was planning this? The questions tumbled out before I could stop them, and I realized I was crying, tears streaming down my face as I tried to process what was happening. Robert's expression softened as he looked at me. "There's a personal letter here for you, Sarah. Mrs. Mitchell specifically requested that it be given to you after the trust reading." He handed me an envelope, smaller than the trust documents, but somehow heavier, with my name written in Eleanor's careful script across the front. With shaking hands, I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. Eleanor's handwriting was weaker than I remembered, but still distinctly hers, and I could almost hear her voice as I read. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then you've just learned about the trust and you're probably feeling confused and overwhelmed. I want you to know that every penny in that account represents a Sunday afternoon we spent together, a story you listened to, a kindness you showed when no one else was watching. The dollar in my will wasn't meant to hurt you, sweetheart. It was meant to protect you from the greed that money can inspire in people who should love you unconditionally. I've watched our family for 79 years, and I've seen how money changes people, how it makes them calculate the value of relationships based on potential inheritance rather than genuine affection. You were the only one who came to see me because you wanted to, not because you felt obligated, or because you were hoping for something in return. You listened to my stories even when I repeated them. You helped me with my garden even though you killed every plant in your own apartment. You made me feel valuable as a person, not just as a bank account. The trust has conditions because I wanted to be absolutely certain that my money would go to someone who understood the difference between wealth and worth. You've proven that difference every Sunday for the past 5 years. The money is yours, Sarah, but more importantly, so is the knowledge that you were loved completely and unconditionally by someone who saw the best in you, even when you couldn't see it yourself. Use this gift wisely, not just the money but the lesson it represents. Surround yourself with people who value you for who you are, not what you have. And remember that the greatest inheritance anyone can leave is the memory of having lived with kindness and integrity. All my love, Grandma Eleanor." I was sobbing by the time I finished reading, my tears staining the paper as I held it against my chest. The room around me seemed to fade away, the angry voices of my family becoming distant background noise as I absorbed Eleanor's words. She'd known exactly what would happen in this room, had anticipated every argument and accusation, and had structured everything to protect me from the fallout of her decision. Jessica's voice cut through my emotional fog like a knife. "Let me see that letter. I want to know what lies she told you to justify this theft." She reached across the table, trying to grab the letter from my hands, but I pulled it back protectively. "It's not theft," I said, my voice stronger now, fueled by Eleanor's words, and the growing realization that I didn't need to apologize for being loved. "It's a gift from someone who knew the difference between family who cares and family who just shows up when there's something to gain." The truth of those words seemed to hit Jessica like a physical blow. Her face flushed red, and I saw something crumble in her expression, a facade of success and control that had been hiding years of insecurity and pressure. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "David and I are leveraged to the hilt. The house, the cars, the kids' school. We were counting on this money. We need it." And there it was, the admission that explained everything. Jessica hadn't been visiting Eleanor out of love or obligation, but out of calculation. She'd been banking on an inheritance that would solve her financial problems, probably for years. The realization made me sad rather than angry, because I remembered the cousin who used to share her Halloween candy with me before life and expectations had taught her to measure relationships in dollars and cents. Uncle Tom's approach was more direct. "Sarah, be reasonable. You're a librarian living in a one-bedroom apartment. What are you going to do with $8 million? Think about what Eleanor would really want, her money keeping the family together, not tearing it apart." But I'd heard this song before, the melody of family obligation that had been playing in the background of my life since childhood. The quiet expectation that I would be the one to sacrifice, to step back, to make things easier for everyone else. Eleanor's letter had shown me something different, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable people's worst impulses. "I think Eleanor made her wishes pretty clear," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos in my heart. "She wanted her money to go to someone who valued her for who she was, not what she had. And she wanted that person to be me." The aftermath of that statement was swift and brutal. Jessica gathered her things with sharp, angry movements, her earlier composure completely shattered. "This isn't over, Sarah. We'll fight this in court. We'll prove that you manipulated a vulnerable old woman." But her threats felt hollow, desperate attempts to maintain control of a situation that had already slipped away from her. Uncle Tom was more measured but equally resolute. "I'm disappointed in you, Sarah. Eleanor always said family comes first, and you're choosing money over your own relatives." He stood to leave, straightening his tie with the kind of dignity that came from years of business negotiations. But I could see the defeat in his shoulders. As my family filed out of the conference room, leaving me alone with Robert Chen and the documents that had just changed my life, I felt a strange mixture of grief and relief. I'd lost the family I'd thought I had, but I'd gained something more valuable. The knowledge that I'd been truly loved by someone who saw my worth when I couldn't see it myself. Robert was organizing the papers with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd overseen many family dramas over the years. "There will be paperwork to complete," he said gently, "arrangements to make with the Swiss firm, tax implications to consider. But Sarah, I want you to know that, in 30 years of practicing law, I've never seen anyone set up a trust with such careful thought and clear intentions. Your grandmother knew exactly what she was doing." I wiped my eyes and tried to compose myself, though I felt like I was floating outside my own body. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Now," he said with a small smile, "you get to decide what kind of person you want to be with $8.5 million. But based on what I've observed today, I think Eleanor chose her beneficiary very well." As I left the law office and walked out into the Phoenix evening, the desert air warm against my skin and the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk, I realized that Eleanor had given me more than money. She'd given me proof that love could be unconditional, that kindness had value beyond calculation, and that sometimes the people who see us most clearly are the ones everyone else takes for granted. The dollar bill in my purse, Eleanor's symbolic inheritance, felt heavier than all the trust documents combined. It represented 29 years of being overlooked, undervalued, and treated as an afterthought by people who should have known better. But it also represented the moment when someone who truly knew me decided I was worth more than anyone had ever imagined. Tomorrow, I would start the process of claiming my inheritance and figuring out what to do with a fortune I'd never expected. But tonight, I was just Sarah Mitchell, the granddaughter who'd been loved completely by someone who understood that the most valuable thing you can give another person is the gift of being truly seen. The drive back to my apartment in Tempe felt like traveling through a different dimension. Every familiar landmark seemed strange and foreign, as if the revelation in Robert Chen's office had shifted the entire world off its axis. I gripped the steering wheel of my Honda Civic, my knuckles white against the worn leather, while Eleanor's letter lay carefully folded in my purse on the passenger seat. $8.5 million. The number kept echoing in my mind like a mantra I couldn't quite believe. I pulled into my usual parking spot outside the modest apartment complex where I'd lived for the past 3 years. The building was nothing special, beige stucco with a small pool that rarely got cleaned, and a laundry room that smelled perpetually of fabric softener and broken dreams. But it had been home, a place where I could afford the rent on my library salary, and still have enough left over for groceries and the occasional movie night with my coworker Marcus. Now, looking at the peeling paint around my front door and the flickering porch light that the landlord kept promising to fix, I felt disconnected from this life I'd built with such careful attention to staying within my means. My neighbor, Mrs. Garcia, was watering her plants on the small patio next to mine, and she waved as I climbed the exterior stairs to my second-floor unit. "Sarah, Mija, you look like you've seen a ghost. Everything okay?" Her voice carried the warm concern that had made her my favorite neighbor since I'd moved in, always ready with homemade tamales when I was working late, or a listening ear when I needed to vent about difficult patrons at the library. "Just a long day, Mrs. Garcia. Family stuff." I managed a weak smile, knowing that any attempt to explain what had actually happened would sound like the plot of a telenovela. How do you tell someone that your grandmother secretly made you a millionaire while your family thinks you manipulated a vulnerable old woman? The complexity of the situation felt overwhelming, like trying to explain quantum physics to a toddler. Inside my apartment, the familiar surroundings felt simultaneously comforting and claustrophobic. My small living room with its second-hand furniture and carefully tended plants, the kitchen where I'd learned to make Eleanor's famous chocolate chip cookies, the bedroom where I'd spent countless nights reading library books and wondering if my quiet life would ever amount to anything significant. Everything was exactly as I'd left it that morning, but I felt like a stranger visiting someone else's carefully constructed world of modest contentment. I sat on my couch, the same faded blue sectional I'd bought from a thrift store when I first moved in, and pulled out Eleanor's letter to read it again. Her handwriting seemed to shimmer in the lamplight, and I could almost hear her voice speaking the words about kindness and integrity, about the difference between wealth and worth. She'd known this day would come, had planned for it with the precision of a chess master thinking 15 moves ahead, and I felt both honored and terrified by the responsibility she'd placed on my shoulders. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I felt my stomach clench as I saw Jessica's name on the screen. "We need to talk. This whole thing is a misunderstanding. Meet me at Starbucks on Mill Avenue tomorrow at 10 a.m. Please." The message was uncharacteristically humble, without the commanding tone she usually used when she wanted something from me. I stared at the words, trying to decode the subtext, wondering if this was genuine remorse or just another manipulation tactic. I set the phone aside without responding and walked to my kitchen, where I opened the refrigerator and stared at its sparse contents. A half-empty carton of milk, some leftover takeout from the Chinese restaurant down the street, a bag of apples that were starting to look questionable. The mundane reality of my small life felt surreal in the context of having just inherited more money than I'd ever imagined possessing. I could buy 1,000 bags of apples now, could hire someone to shop for me, could eat at restaurants where the menu didn't have prices. But the thought felt abstract, like playing pretend rather than contemplating a real future. Sleep proved elusive that night. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling fan that wobbled slightly on its mount, listening to the sounds of the apartment complex settling around me. Through the thin walls I could hear my neighbor's television playing late-night infomercials, and from somewhere outside came the distant hum of traffic on the freeway. These sounds had become the soundtrack of my adult life, the audio backdrop to my careful existence of library work and quiet evenings at home. But now they felt like echoes from a previous life, memories of a person I used to be before Eleanor's trust fund turned me into someone I didn't recognize. I found myself thinking about the Swiss investment firm that had been managing Eleanor's money for 15 years, wondering what kind of people they were and whether they'd been expecting this day to come. Had they known about me, this granddaughter in Phoenix who visited every Sunday and helped with grocery shopping? The international nature of the trust felt impossibly sophisticated, like something from a movie rather than my real life. I'd never even been outside the United States, had never owned a passport or thought about Swiss bank accounts except in the context of spy novels and Hollywood thrillers. The next morning arrived gray and overcast, unusual for Phoenix in October but somehow fitting for my mood. I called in sick to work, something I rarely did, and spent the morning pacing around my apartment while trying to decide whether to meet Jessica. Part of me wanted to hear what she had to say, to understand how she was processing yesterday's revelations. But another part of me feared that facing her would somehow diminish the clarity I'd found in Eleanor's letter, that her persuasive arguments might make me doubt my grandmother's intentions. Marcus called around 9, his voice bright with the enthusiasm he brought to everything from organizing library events to planning his weekend hiking trips. "Sarah, you sound terrible. Are you actually sick or just avoiding Mrs. Henderson's book club discussion about romance novels?" He'd become my closest friend since I started working at the library, one of those genuinely kind people who seemed to collect stray humans the way some people collected vintage postcards. "Family drama," I said, grateful for his voice even though I couldn't begin to explain what had happened. "My grandmother's will reading was yesterday, and it got complicated. Want to talk about it?" I'm between shifts at the coffee shop, and I make excellent listening ears. Marcus worked part-time at a local cafe, in addition to his library job, always hustling to pay off his student loans and save money for graduate school. His work ethic had always made me feel guilty about my own modest ambitions, but now I wondered if ambition was really about money, or about something else entirely. "Maybe later," I said, though I knew I wouldn't be able to tell him the truth anytime soon. How do you explain to someone who counts every dollar that you've just inherited millions? How do you maintain a friendship when the fundamental circumstances of your life have changed so dramatically? The isolation of my new situation was beginning to sink in. The realization that wealth might solve some problems but create others I hadn't anticipated. I decided to meet Jessica after all, partly from curiosity, and partly from a need to understand how our relationship might evolve in this new reality. The Starbucks on Mill Avenue was crowded with Arizona State University students and local professionals grabbing their morning caffeine fix, the kind of place where I'd always felt slightly out of place but had learned to navigate over the years. I arrived early and claimed a corner table, ordering a simple coffee while watching the door for Jessica's inevitable dramatic entrance. She appeared 15 minutes late, as always, but something was different about her usual confidence. Her designer clothes were perfectly coordinated, her makeup flawless, her blonde hair styled with professional precision, but there was a tension in her shoulders that I'd never noticed before. She moved through the crowded cafe with purpose, but her smile seemed forced, and when she hugged me in greeting, I caught the faint scent of the prescription anxiety medication that she'd mentioned taking during particularly stressful periods at work. "Sarah, thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would after yesterday." She settled into the chair across from me, setting down her venti caramel macchiato, an expensive handbag with movements that seemed calculated rather than natural. "I know the whole thing was a shock for everyone, but I think we need to talk about what this means for our family." I studied her face, looking for traces of the cousin who used to sneak cookies from Eleanor's kitchen during holiday visits, but that girl seemed as distant as my own previous life. "What do you want to talk about, Jessica?" I kept my voice neutral, though I could feel my heart rate increasing in anticipation of whatever argument she'd prepared. "Look, I was upset yesterday. We all were. Finding out that Eleanor set up this elaborate trust without telling anyone was a shock, and I probably said things I shouldn't have." She paused to take a sip of her drink, and I noticed her hands trembling slightly. "But I've been thinking about this all night, and I think there's a way to handle this that works for everyone. Here it comes," I thought. The negotiation phase where she tries to convince me to share Eleanor's money according to her vision of fairness. I'd been expecting this conversation since I left the law office, had even mentally rehearsed responses to various arguments she might make. But seeing her in person, noticing the stress lines around her eyes and the way she kept checking her phone for messages, made me realize that her financial situation might be even more precarious than she'd let on yesterday. "Eleanor was getting old, Sarah, you know that. And old people sometimes make decisions that don't reflect their real intentions." Jessica leaned forward, her voice taking on the persuasive tone she probably used in client presentations. She loved all of us equally, but she was probably confused about family dynamics, maybe even a little manipulated by people who took advantage of her vulnerability. I felt anger flare in my chest, but I kept my expression calm. "Are you suggesting that I manipulated her into leaving me money?" "Not deliberately, maybe. But think about it from her perspective. You were the only one who visited regularly, who spent time with her when she was lonely. She might have interpreted that as something special when really it was just you being a good person." Jessica's voice was gentle, almost therapeutic, as if she were helping me understand a complex situation rather than accusing me of elder abuse. So you're saying my relationship with Eleanor wasn't special, it was just coincidental? I could hear the edge creeping into my voice, but I didn't try to hide it. That 5 years of Sunday visits and grocery runs were just me being generically nice? I'm saying that Eleanor might have misunderstood the nature of your relationship with her, and that her decision to leave you $8 million while giving the rest of us token amounts doesn't reflect the kind of person she really was. Jessica pulled out her phone and showed me a photo of Eleanor with her grandchildren from last Christmas, all of us smiling around her dining room table. This is the grandmother I remember, the one who loved all of us equally and wanted the best for our entire family. I looked at the photo, remembering that Christmas dinner, and how Eleanor had insisted on cooking despite her arthritis, how she'd made everyone's favorite dishes and given thoughtful gifts that showed she'd been paying attention to our lives. But I also remembered how Jessica had spent most of the evening checking her work email, how Uncle Tom had fallen asleep in front of the television, how quickly everyone had left after opening presents. Eleanor had asked me to stay and help with the dishes, and we'd ended up talking until almost midnight about her fears of becoming a burden on her family. You're right that she loved all of us, I said carefully. But love doesn't always mean equal treatment. Sometimes it means recognizing people's different needs and responding accordingly. Jessica's composure slipped slightly, and I saw a flash of the desperation she'd shown in the conference room. Sarah, I need you to understand something. David and I are in serious financial trouble. The house, the cars, Emma's private school, Ryan's therapy sessions. We've been living on credit, expecting that Eleanor's inheritance would help us get back on stable ground. Without that money, we might lose everything. There it was. The honest admission that explained everything about yesterday's drama. Jessica hadn't been upset about family fairness or Eleanor's mental state. She'd been panicked about her own financial survival. The revelation was both enlightening and heartbreaking because it confirmed what Eleanor had suspected about the motivations behind family relationships. I'm sorry to hear about your financial situation, I said, and I meant it. But I don't think Eleanor's solution was wrong. She gave her money to someone who cared about her for who she was, not what she could provide. But that's not fair to the rest of us. Jessica's voice rose, attracting glances from nearby tables. Just because we were busy with our own lives doesn't mean we loved her less. We all have responsibilities, careers, families to take care of. We can't all be professional granddaughters with nothing better to do than visit old ladies. The insult hit harder than I expected, partly because it echoed doubts I'd had about my own life choices. Professional granddaughter. Was that really how my family saw me? As someone with so little going on that I had time to waste on elderly relatives? The characterization stung, but it also revealed the fundamental difference between how Jessica and I viewed relationships with family members. Is that what you think I was doing? Playing professional granddaughter to get money? I could hear the hurt in my own voice, but I didn't try to hide it. Do you really believe I spent 5 years visiting Eleanor because I was planning some elaborate inheritance scheme? Jessica had the grace to look ashamed. No, I don't think you planned this, but I think Eleanor took advantage of your good nature, made you feel responsible for her emotional well-being, and then used that manufactured closeness to justify cutting out the rest of her family. Or maybe, I said, standing up from the table, she recognized the difference between people who loved her and people who loved her money. Maybe she saw through the Christmas visits and birthday cards to the calculations underneath, and she decided to give her wealth to someone who never calculated its value. Jessica stood too, her designer heels clicking against the cafe floor. This isn't over, Sarah. We're going to contest the trust, prove that Eleanor wasn't competent to make these decisions. We'll show that you influenced her, isolated her from her family, manipulated her into believing we didn't care about her. Good luck with that, I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. Because Robert Chen has 15 years of documentation showing that Eleanor was mentally competent, and I have 5 years of memory showing that she was loved by someone who never asked for anything in return. I left Jessica sitting in the Starbucks, surrounded by the noise and energy of people starting their normal days, and walked out into the Phoenix morning. The sun had burned through the earlier cloud cover, and the desert air felt clean and sharp in my lungs. For the first time since yesterday's revelation, I felt certain about Eleanor's decision and my right to accept her gift. Jessica's desperation had revealed the difference between loving someone and needing them, between grief and financial panic, between family loyalty and entitlement. My phone buzzed with a call from Robert Chen's office, and I answered with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. His secretary, Mrs. Patterson, had a warm voice that reminded me of Eleanor's Bridge Club friends. "Miss Mitchell, Mr. Chen would like to schedule a meeting with you to discuss the trust administration process. The Swiss firm has been in contact, and there are several documents that need your signature." "Of course," I said, though the reality of actually accessing Eleanor's money still felt abstract. "When would be convenient?" "How about tomorrow afternoon at 2? And Miss Mitchell, Mr. Chen wanted me to mention that there may be some urgency to completing the paperwork. He's received calls from other family members about contesting the trust, and he feels it would be in your best interest to establish your legal standing as quickly as possible." After ending the call, I drove to Papago Park, one of Eleanor's favorite places for our occasional outings, when she was feeling strong enough to leave the house. The red sandstone formations rose from the desert floor like ancient sculptures, and I found the bench where we'd sat just 6 months ago, sharing a picnic lunch and watching rock climbers scale the steep faces. She'd been quieter than usual that day, more contemplative, and I'd wondered if she was feeling the weight of her advancing age. "Sarah, honey," she'd said, watching a hawk circle overhead, "do you ever think about what makes a life worthwhile? Not successful or impressive, but actually worthwhile?" I'd been surprised by the question, accustomed to lighter conversations about library patrons and neighborhood gossip. "I guess I think about it sometimes." "Why do you ask?" "I've been thinking about legacy lately, about what I want to leave behind when I'm gone. Not just money or property, but something that actually matters." She'd turned to look at me then, her blue eyes still sharp despite her 79 years. "I think the most important thing we can leave behind is proof that we knew how to love people well, that we understood the difference between caring about someone and needing something from them." At the time, I'd thought she was just in one of her philosophical moods, the kind of deep thinking that seemed to come with age and the awareness of mortality. But now, sitting on the same bench and remembering her words, I understood that she'd been trying to prepare me for what was coming, to give me the framework for understanding her decision. Eleanor had seen through Jessica's financial desperation and Uncle Tom's sense of entitlement to the deeper truth about family relationships. She'd recognized that love based on expectation wasn't really love at all, that the people who showed up only when they needed something weren't the same as the people who showed up because they wanted to be there. And she'd structured her final gift to reflect that understanding, to reward genuine affection while exposing the calculations that had been masquerading as family loyalty. The afternoon sun was intense, even in October, and I felt sweat beading on my forehead as I sat thinking about the choices ahead of me. $8.5 million could change everything about my life, could give me opportunities I'd never imagined and freedoms I'd never dared to want. But it also came with the responsibility of proving Eleanor's judgment correct, of living up to the values she'd seen in me and that I was only beginning to recognize in myself. I thought about Jessica's desperation, about Uncle Tom's business-minded approach to family relationships, about the way yesterday's revelation had instantly transformed me from the quiet granddaughter into the family villain. Eleanor had known this would happen, had anticipated the accusations and resentment that would follow her decision. She'd structured the trust not just to reward me, but to protect me from the pressure to share her gift according to other people's definitions of fairness. As I drove home, I passed the library where I'd worked for the past 4 years, the building that had become as familiar as my own apartment. Through the windows, I could see Marcus at the reference desk, probably helping a patron find information about local history or tax preparation. My absence today had left them short-staffed, and I felt a pang of guilt about calling in sick when I wasn't actually ill. But how could I explain that I'd needed the day to process becoming a millionaire? How could I return to checking out books and processing returns when my entire understanding of my place in the world had been fundamentally altered? The questions felt overwhelming, but Eleanor's letter had given me a framework for thinking about them. She'd written about using the gift wisely, about understanding the difference between wealth and worth, about surrounding myself with people who valued me for who I was rather than what I had. The money was just the beginning, she'd implied. The real test would be what I did with it and how I let it change me. That evening, I sat in my apartment with Eleanor's letter spread on my coffee table, along with the trust documents and Robert Chen's business card. The familiar sounds of my neighbor's television and the distant freeway traffic seemed to belong to a different person's life, someone who worried about monthly rent and whether to splurge on name-brand groceries. I was still that person in many ways, but I was also someone else now, someone with choices and possibilities that I'd never imagined having. My phone rang, and I saw my mother's number on the screen. She lived in Tucson with my stepfather, and we talked every few weeks about mundane things like work and the weather. She'd been at Eleanor's funeral but had left early, claiming she needed to get back to take care of my stepfather's diabetes medication schedule. I'd always assumed she felt awkward around Eleanor's side of the family, that she saw them as too wealthy and sophisticated for her comfortable middle-class life. "Sarah, honey, I heard about the will reading yesterday. Uncle Tom called me this morning." Her voice was careful, the tone she used when she was trying to navigate a complicated situation without taking sides. "He said Eleanor left you some money in a trust?" "Yes, she did." I kept my response simple, not sure how much Tom had told her, and not ready to deal with another family member's opinions about Eleanor's decision. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. She always had a soft spot for you, and I know how much time you spent with her in recent years." There was a pause, and I could almost hear her choosing her words carefully. Tom seemed to think there might be some legal issues with the trust. Something about Eleanor not being competent when she set it up? "The trust was established 15 years ago when Eleanor was in perfect health," I said, feeling the familiar anger rise at the suggestion that my grandmother had been manipulated. "She had medical evaluations confirming her mental competency, and she worked with reputable attorneys and financial advisors to set everything up properly." "I'm sure she did, honey. Eleanor was always sharp as a tack, even at the end." My mother's voice was soothing, but I could hear the underlying tension. "I just want to make sure you're okay with all of this. Sudden wealth can be overwhelming, and family money can sometimes create problems that nobody anticipates." She was right, of course. The events of the past 2 days had already created more family drama than I'd experienced in my entire adult life, and I was only beginning to understand the implications of Eleanor's decision. The money was a gift, but it was also a test, a challenge to maintain my values and relationships while navigating a completely new reality. "I'm taking it one day at a time," I said, which was the truth even though it felt inadequate to describe the complexity of my situation. Eleanor left me a letter explaining her reasoning, and I think she made the right choice for the right reasons. "I'm sure she did, sweetheart. Just remember that money doesn't define who you are, and the people who love you will continue to love you, regardless of your bank account balance." My mother's words were meant to be comforting, but they reminded me that the people who truly loved me were a smaller group than I'd previously believed. After the call, I found myself thinking about the nature of family relationships and the way money revealed people's true priorities. Eleanor's trust had been designed to identify the difference between conditional and unconditional love, between people who cared about her and people who cared about her resources. The test had worked exactly as she'd planned, exposing the calculations that had been hidden beneath years of polite family gatherings and obligatory holiday visits. I looked around my modest apartment, at the carefully budgeted life I'd built over the past few years, and tried to imagine what changes the trust money might bring. I could move to a better neighborhood, buy a car that didn't require constant repairs, travel to places I'd only read about in books. But I could also maintain the values that had earned Eleanor's trust in the first place. The commitment to authentic relationships and simple kindness that had made her feel loved and valued. The choice was mine now, and Eleanor's letter had made it clear that she trusted me to make it wisely. The money was just the beginning of a larger test, an opportunity to prove that wealth and worth were indeed different things, that inheritance could be about more than just assets and bank accounts. As I prepared for bed, I felt the weight of that responsibility, and the excitement of possibilities I'd never dared to imagine. Tomorrow, I would meet with Robert Chen and begin the process of claiming my inheritance. But tonight, I was still Sarah Mitchell, the granddaughter who had been loved completely by someone who saw her true worth. And that, I realized, was the most valuable gift Eleanor had given me. Not the money itself, but the knowledge that I was worthy of such extraordinary love. The meeting with Robert Chen the next afternoon felt like stepping into a different universe. His office, which had seemed intimidating just 2 days earlier, now felt like a sanctuary where the impossible was being transformed into reality. The mahogany desk that had witnessed my family's shocked reactions was now covered with documents that would officially make me one of the wealthiest people I'd ever known personally. Robert greeted me with the kind of professional warmth that suggested he'd been thinking about my situation since our last meeting. "Sarah, thank you for coming in so quickly. I know this is all moving very fast, but given the family dynamics we witnessed yesterday, I think it's important to establish your legal position as soon as possible." He gestured to a chair across from his desk, and I noticed he'd arranged the papers in neat stacks, each one tagged with colorful sticky notes that probably explained their significance. The Swiss trust documents were in a separate folder, thicker than I'd expected, and bound with an official-looking ribbon that made everything feel more formal and irreversible. "Before we begin with the paperwork," Robert said, settling into his own chair, "I want to address something that's been troubling me since yesterday. Your cousin Jessica called this morning, as did your Uncle Tom. They're both interested in contesting the trust, and they've asked me to recommend attorneys who specialize in estate litigation." I felt my stomach tighten, though I'd been expecting this news since Jessica's barely veiled threats at Starbucks. "Did you recommend anyone?" I gave them the names of 3 reputable firms, as I'm ethically obligated to do. "But Sarah, I also want you to understand that their chances of success are extremely limited." Robert leaned forward, his expression serious. "Your grandmother was meticulous in her planning. She underwent cognitive assessments, worked with multiple attorneys, and documented her reasoning extensively. The trust was established when she was in perfect health, and the conditions for distribution are clear and objective." He pulled out a thick folder that I hadn't seen before, labeled with Eleanor's name in his careful handwriting. Eleanor updated this file annually for the past 15 years. She documented every family interaction, every holiday gathering, every birthday that was remembered or forgotten. She kept detailed records of who visited, who called, who sent cards, and who only appeared when they needed something. The idea that Eleanor had been keeping such detailed records felt both touching and slightly unsettling. I'd always known she was observant, but I hadn't realized she'd been systematically documenting our family's behavior patterns. What kind of records? Everything. She had a calendar where she marked family visits, and she kept copies of all the cards and letters she received. She documented phone calls, noted who remembered her birthday without being reminded, and tracked who made excuses for missing family gatherings. Robert opened the folder and showed me pages of Eleanor's careful handwriting, dates and names, and brief descriptions of interactions. "She was building a case," I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. She knew there would be challenges to the trust, so she was creating evidence to support her decision. "Exactly, and the pattern that emerges from these records is remarkable. Over the past 5 years, you visited her 53 times per year on average. Jessica visited 12 times, mostly around holidays or when she needed something. Your Uncle Tom visited 8 times, usually for less than an hour, and often to discuss Eleanor's financial planning or investment strategies." The clinical nature of the documentation was both vindicating and heartbreaking. Eleanor had been watching her family with the careful attention of someone who understood that love could be measured in actions rather than words, that presence was more valuable than presence, that consistency mattered more than grand gestures. "There's something else," Robert continued, pulling out a smaller file. Eleanor arranged for a private investigator to document the family's financial situations over the past 2 years. She wanted to understand whether people's interest in her was motivated by genuine affection or by financial necessity. I stared at him, shocked by the extent of Eleanor's preparations. She hired a private investigator? She did, and the results were quite illuminating. Jessica and her husband have been living significantly beyond their means for several years, using credit cards and home equity loans to maintain their lifestyle. They've been counting on Eleanor's inheritance to resolve their financial difficulties. Tom has been financially stable, but he's been discussing Eleanor's estate with his financial advisor for over a year, making plans based on his expected inheritance. The revelation felt like a betrayal of my family's privacy, but also like a vindication of Eleanor's instincts. She'd seen through the surface relationships to the calculations beneath, and she'd prepared for the inevitable accusations and legal challenges that would follow her decision. Meanwhile, Robert continued, your financial records show a pattern of modest living within your means, with no debt beyond normal monthly expenses and no discussions with financial advisors about potential inheritance. The investigator found no evidence that you'd ever inquired about Eleanor's financial situation or made any assumptions about future inheritance. I felt tears stinging my eyes as I realized the full scope of what Eleanor had done. She'd protected me not just with her trust fund, but with an entire framework of evidence that would support her decision and defend against any accusations of manipulation or undue influence. The Swiss firm has been very impressed with Eleanor's planning, Robert said, pulling out the international documents. They've been managing similar trusts for decades, and they said her documentation was among the most thorough they'd ever seen. They're prepared to testify about her mental competency and the legitimacy of her instructions if necessary. We spent the next hour going through the paperwork required to access the trust funds. The Swiss firm, Bergman and Associates, had been managing Eleanor's international investments with the kind of discretion and expertise that came from generations of experience with wealthy American families. They'd grown her initial $2 million investment into over $8 million through careful diversification and conservative growth strategies. The money is currently held in a combination of Swiss francs, euros, and US dollars, Robert explained, showing me investment statements that looked like something from a movie. Eleanor was very concerned about currency fluctuations and economic instability, so she insisted on diversification across multiple stable currencies. The practical aspects of accessing the money were more complex than I'd imagined. There were tax implications to consider, legal requirements for reporting foreign assets, and decisions to be made about how to structure the funds for maximum protection and growth. Robert recommended a team of specialists, including a tax attorney, an international banking expert, and a financial advisor who had experience with sudden wealth management. Sudden wealth syndrome is a real phenomenon, he explained as we reviewed the list of recommended professionals. Many people who receive large inheritances or lottery winnings struggle with the psychological and practical challenges of managing significant wealth. Eleanor was aware of this risk, and she included provisions in the trust for professional financial guidance and psychological support if needed. Even in death, Eleanor had been thinking about my well-being, anticipating challenges I hadn't even considered. The money was a gift, but it was also a responsibility, and she'd tried to prepare me for both the opportunities and the difficulties that would come with sudden wealth. There's one more thing, Robert said, pulling out a sealed envelope with my name written in Eleanor's handwriting. She left instructions that this letter should be given to you after you'd reviewed all the trust documents and understood the full scope of what she'd planned. I opened the envelope with trembling hands, my heart racing as I unfolded the pages inside. Eleanor's handwriting was weaker than in her previous letter, suggesting she'd written this one more recently, possibly in her final weeks. My dearest Sarah, the letter began. If you're reading this, then you've learned about the investigation and the documentation, and you're probably feeling overwhelmed by the extent of my preparations. I want you to understand that none of this was done to hurt our family or to punish anyone for their choices. It was done to protect you and to ensure that my final wishes would be respected regardless of the challenges they might face. I know that Jessica and Tom will contest the trust, and I know they'll accuse you of manipulation and undue influence. They'll claim that I was vulnerable and confused, that you took advantage of my loneliness and isolation. They'll try to make you doubt your own worthiness and my judgment. But I want you to know that every decision I made was based on 15 years of careful observation and clear thinking. The money I'm leaving you represents more than just financial security. It represents validation of the values you've demonstrated throughout your adult life. Kindness without expectation, presence without agenda, love without calculation. These are rare qualities, Sarah, and they deserve to be rewarded and protected. I hired the investigator not because I didn't trust my own judgment, but because I knew others would challenge it. I documented our family's interactions not because I enjoyed keeping score, but because I understood that love could be measured in actions rather than words. I worked with Swiss financial experts not because I wanted to hide money from my family, but because I wanted to ensure that my gift to you would be protected from people who might try to claim it for themselves. You may feel guilty about accepting this inheritance, about the way it will change your relationships with family members who expected different treatment. But remember that their anger is not really about fairness or family loyalty. It's about their own financial expectations and their discomfort with having their motivations exposed. You didn't create this situation, Sarah. You simply lived your life with integrity and kindness. And those qualities caught the attention of someone who understood their value. Use this money wisely, but don't let it change who you are. Remember that wealth is a tool, not a destination, and that the most important things in life cannot be bought or sold. Surround yourself with people who knew you before you had money, and who will love you regardless of your bank account balance. And remember that the greatest inheritance I can leave you is not money, but the knowledge that you are worthy of extraordinary love. Your grandmother Eleanor, who loved you beyond measure. I was crying by the time I finished reading, tears streaming down my face as I absorbed the full weight of Eleanor's planning and protection. She'd anticipated every challenge, prepared for every accusation, and structured her gift to survive any legal assault. But more than that, she'd seen something in me that I was only beginning to recognize in myself, a worthiness that transcended financial calculations and family expectations. Robert handed me a box of tissues and waited quietly while I composed myself. When I finally looked up, he was smiling with the kind of gentle approval that reminded me why Eleanor had trusted him with her affairs. She was a remarkable woman, he said simply. In 30 years of practice, I've never seen anyone plan their legacy with such careful attention to both practical and emotional considerations. She didn't just want to leave you money, Sarah. She wanted to leave you protected. The next several hours were spent signing documents, reviewing investment options, and establishing the practical framework for accessing my inheritance. The Swiss firm required multiple forms of identification, biometric verification, and encrypted communication protocols that made the whole process feel like something from a spy novel. But gradually, the abstract concept of $8.5 million began to feel real, transforming from impossible dream into legal reality. By the time I left Robert's office, I had access to a Swiss bank account, a team of financial advisors, and a legal framework that would protect Eleanor's gift from any challenges my family might mount. I also had a profound understanding of how much my grandmother had loved me, how carefully she'd planned for my future, and how thoroughly she'd prepared to defend her decision. The drive home felt different this time, less surreal and more purposeful. I was no longer just Sarah Mitchell, the library assistant who'd inherited unexpected wealth. I was Sarah Mitchell, the granddaughter who'd been chosen and protected by someone who understood the difference between love and need, between family loyalty and financial calculation. My phone had been buzzing with messages throughout the meeting, but I'd ignored them in favor of focusing on the legal proceedings. Now, stopped at a red light, I checked the accumulation of texts and voicemails that had arrived during my absence. Uncle Tom had called twice, his messages increasingly urgent as he requested meetings to discuss, quote, family unity and, quote, reasonable solutions. Jessica had sent a series of texts that progressed from apologetic to demanding, ending with a threat to take this public if I didn't agree to share the inheritance. Most surprising was a voicemail from my mother, her voice tight with stress as she explained that she'd been receiving calls from various family members who wanted her to talk sense into me. The pressure campaign had already begun, and I realized that Eleanor's protective documentation would be essential in the coming weeks. But there was also a message from Marcus, his voice warm and concerned, as he asked if I was okay and whether I needed someone to talk to. His genuine care, untainted by financial interest or family obligation, reminded me of Eleanor's advice about surrounding myself with people who'd known me before I had money. I decided to call him back, pulling into a parking lot near the university campus where students were hurrying between classes in the late afternoon heat. Marcus answered on the second ring, his voice brightening when he heard my voice. Sarah, I've been worried about you. 2 days of calling in sick is completely unlike you, and Mrs. Rodriguez is starting to panic about the upcoming book sale preparations. I'm okay, I said, though the words felt inadequate to describe my current situation. The family situation is just more complicated than I expected. Can we meet for coffee sometime soon? I could really use a friend right now. Of course. How about tomorrow? after my shift at the cafe. I get off at 6, and I know a quiet place where we can actually have a conversation without fighting with espresso machines and chattering customers. His uncomplicated offer of friendship felt like a lifeline in the midst of the family drama that was swirling around Eleanor's decision. Here was someone who cared about my well-being without any ulterior motives, who offered support without expecting anything in return. Eleanor had been right about the importance of surrounding myself with people who knew my true value. That evening, I sat in my apartment with Eleanor's letters spread across my coffee table, along with copies of the trust documents and the contact information for my new team of financial advisors. The contrast between my modest surroundings and the paperwork representing enormous wealth felt surreal, like evidence of two different lives that were somehow both mine. I found myself thinking about the private investigator's reports, about the clinical documentation of my family's financial desperation and calculated interest in Eleanor's money. The knowledge was power, but it was also a burden, because it meant I could never again pretend that their relationships with me were based purely on family affection. Jessica's financial troubles explained so much about her behavior over the past few years. The way she'd started asking more questions about Eleanor's health and living situation, the increasing frequency of her visits during the months before Eleanor's death. What I'd interpreted as growing concern for an aging relative had actually been growing panic about her own financial future. Uncle Tom's situation was more complex, because he didn't need Eleanor's money for basic survival, but he'd apparently been making plans based on his expected inheritance. The private investigator had documented conversations with his financial advisor about strategies for managing the inheritance, discussions about tax implications, and investment opportunities that revealed how much he'd been counting on Eleanor's death to enhance his already comfortable lifestyle. The documentation painted a picture of a family that had been treating Eleanor like a financial resource rather than a person, calculating her worth in terms of future inheritance rather than present relationship. The contrast with my own behavior was stark and somewhat embarrassing, because I'd never thought of myself as particularly virtuous, just as someone who enjoyed spending time with an interesting and caring relative. But Eleanor had seen something different in my Sunday visits and grocery store runs. She'd recognized genuine affection, where I'd seen simple kindness, authentic relationship, where I'd seen basic decency. Her careful documentation had revealed patterns I'd never noticed, behaviors that distinguished love from obligation, presence from performance. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts, and I saw a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered, and was greeted by a professional female voice that identified herself as an attorney representing Jessica and Uncle Tom. Miss Mitchell, my name is Patricia Hoffman, and I represent the Mitchell family in their challenge to Eleanor Mitchell's trust arrangement. I understand you've been cooperating with the trust administration, but I wanted to reach out to discuss the possibility of a settlement that might avoid lengthy and expensive litigation. The call felt like a violation, an intrusion into the private space where I'd been processing Eleanor's gift and planning my future. I'd known the legal challenges would come, but I hadn't expected them to begin so quickly, or with such professional aggression. I don't think I should be talking to you without my own attorney present, I said, remembering Robert's warnings about the importance of proper legal representation. Of course, that's your right, but I wanted to extend an olive branch before positions become entrenched on both sides. My clients are prepared to offer a very generous settlement that would allow you to keep a significant portion of the trust funds while ensuring that Eleanor's other descendants receive their fair share of her estate. The language was carefully chosen, designed to make Jessica and Tom's demands sound reasonable, while implying that my position was somehow unfair or illegitimate. I could hear the manipulation in her tone, the suggestion that reasonable people would surely want to avoid conflict and find compromise. Eleanor's trust was very specific about her intentions, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. She had 15 years to consider her decision, and she worked with experienced professionals to ensure her wishes would be respected. Mrs. Mitchell was elderly and isolated, Miss Mitchell. She may have been influenced by people who took advantage of her vulnerability and loneliness. My clients are concerned that the trust doesn't reflect her true intentions, but rather the manipulations of individuals who gained her confidence for financial gain. The accusation was delivered with professional politeness, but it hit like a physical blow. They were accusing me of elder abuse, of manipulating a vulnerable woman for financial gain. The irony was breathtaking, because the private investigators' reports clearly showed that Jessica and Tom had been the ones calculating Eleanor's financial value and making plans based on her death. "I think this conversation is over," I said, my anger finally overriding my shock. "If you want to challenge the trust, do it through proper legal channels. But don't call me again with accusations and settlement offers." I hung up before she could respond, my hands shaking with anger and adrenaline. The legal battle had officially begun, and I realized that Eleanor's protective documentation would be essential in defending both her legacy and my inheritance. The money she'd left me was already under attack, and I would need to fight to keep it. But I also realized that I was ready for the fight. Eleanor had prepared me with more than just legal documentation and financial resources. She'd given me the knowledge that I was worthy of her extraordinary gift, that my behavior had been observed and valued by someone who understood the difference between authentic and calculated relationships. The accusations and legal challenges couldn't change that fundamental truth. As I prepared for bed, I felt the weight of the inheritance settling around me like a new identity. I was no longer just Sarah Mitchell, the quiet library assistant who lived within her means and visited her grandmother on Sundays. I was Sarah Mitchell, the chosen beneficiary of someone who'd loved me enough to protect me from my own family's greed. The transformation was both thrilling and terrifying, but I was beginning to understand that Eleanor had prepared me for both the opportunities and the challenges that lay ahead. The Swiss trust documents sat on my kitchen counter, official and foreign and somehow magical in their promise of security and freedom. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of actually accessing the money, of transforming legal paperwork into real financial power. But tonight, I was content to know that I'd been loved completely by someone who saw my worth even when I couldn't see it myself, and that her gift would allow me to build a life worthy of such extraordinary affection. The call from David Kim at Bergman & Associates came at 7 in the morning, Swiss precision cutting through my restless sleep like a blade through silk. His accent carried the careful neutrality that came from decades of managing wealthy American families' international affairs, but there was an urgency in his voice that made me instantly alert. "Miss Mitchell, I apologize for calling so early, but we've received some concerning communications regarding your grandmother's trust. There have been inquiries from attorneys claiming to represent other family members, and they're making some rather serious allegations about the legitimacy of Mrs. Mitchell's instructions." I sat up in bed, my mind racing as I processed what this meant. The legal challenges Jessica had threatened were apparently moving faster than I'd anticipated, and they were sophisticated enough to reach across international borders to my Swiss financial advisors. "What kind of allegations?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "They're claiming that Mrs. Mitchell was mentally incompetent when she established the trust, and that she was subject to undue influence from beneficiaries who isolated her from her family. They've requested copies of all our documentation regarding her mental state and decision-making capacity, as well as records of all communications with potential beneficiaries." The clinical language couldn't disguise the seriousness of what was happening. My family wasn't just contesting the trust through American courts. They were trying to attack its foundation by challenging the Swiss firm's compliance with international banking regulations and fiduciary responsibilities. "What does this mean for the trust?" I asked, my voice smaller than I intended. "In the short term, it means we need to be extremely careful about all our procedures and documentation. Swiss banking law requires us to investigate any credible allegations of elder abuse or financial manipulation, and we take these responsibilities very seriously." David's voice was professional but not unsympathetic. "However, I want to assure you that Mrs. Mitchell's case is one of the most thoroughly documented we've ever handled. Her preparations were extraordinary, and we have extensive evidence of her mental competency and clear intentions." He explained that Eleanor had worked with Bergman & Associates for over 20 years, well before establishing the trust that would eventually benefit me. She'd been a sophisticated investor who understood international finance, and had made numerous complex decisions about currency hedging and asset allocation over the decades. The firm had detailed records of her mental acuity and decision-making capacity stretching back to the early 2000s. Mrs. Mitchell also insisted on annual competency evaluations by Swiss medical professionals, David continued. "She understood that American families sometimes challenged international trusts, and she wanted to ensure that our documentation would withstand any legal scrutiny. We have neurological assessments, psychological evaluations, and cognitive testing results spanning the entire 15-year period of the trust's existence. The revelation that Eleanor had been planning for this exact scenario felt both comforting and overwhelming. She'd anticipated not just the family conflict that would follow her death, but the specific legal strategies that would be used to challenge her decisions. Her preparation had been chessmaster level, thinking multiple moves ahead and protecting against attacks she knew would come. "There's something else you should know," David said, his tone becoming more confidential. "The attorneys representing your family have also been making inquiries about your personal finances and relationship with Mrs. Mitchell. They're trying to build a case that you manipulated her by creating financial dependency, or by isolating her from other family members." I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized the scope of what my family was attempting. They weren't just challenging Eleanor's mental state. They were constructing a narrative that would paint me as a predator who'd taken advantage of an elderly woman's loneliness and vulnerability. "But that's not what happened," I said, though I knew that legal battles weren't always decided by truth. "We know that, Miss Mitchell." Mrs. Mitchell documented everything, including her reasoning for choosing you as her beneficiary. She was very clear that your relationship with her was characterized by genuine affection and support, without any financial motivation or manipulation. David paused and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "In fact, she specifically noted that you never asked about her financial situation, never inquired about potential inheritance, and often declined her offers to pay for expenses when you helped her with errands or appointments." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes as David explained the legal procedures that would govern the Swiss response to American court challenges. Bergman and Associates had dealt with international estate disputes before, and they had protocols for protecting their clients' interests while complying with various national legal requirements. "The most important thing for you to understand," David concluded, "is that Swiss banking law heavily favors the documented intentions of competent account holders. Mrs. Mitchell's preparations were specifically designed to meet the highest international standards for estate planning, and we're confident that her wishes will be upheld regardless of any challenges from American courts." After ending the call, I sat in my apartment's small kitchen, drinking coffee and trying to process the escalating complexity of my situation. What had begun as a shocking inheritance had transformed into an international legal battle, with Swiss banking laws and neurological evaluations becoming central to my family's attack on Eleanor's final wishes. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus asking if I was still planning to meet him for coffee that afternoon. His message felt like a lifeline, a connection to my normal life before inheritance and legal challenges had turned everything upside down. I texted back confirming our plans, grateful for the prospect of spending time with someone who knew nothing about Swiss trust funds or estate litigation. But first, I needed to call Robert Chen and update him about the international dimensions of my family's legal strategy. He answered immediately, his voice sharp with the kind of alertness that suggested he'd been expecting this development. "Sarah, I'm glad you called. I've been in contact with the Hoffman firm representing your family, and their approach is more aggressive than I initially anticipated. They're not just challenging the trust's validity, they're trying to build a criminal case for elder abuse and financial exploitation." The word criminal hit me like a physical blow. I'd known that family relationships could be damaged by money, but I hadn't considered that I might face actual criminal charges for accepting Eleanor's gift. Is that possible? Could they really bring criminal charges? It's possible but unlikely to succeed, given the documentation we have. However, the threat of criminal prosecution is often used as leverage in estate disputes, designed to pressure beneficiaries into accepting settlements rather than fighting for their full inheritance. Robert's voice was calm, but serious. The good news is that Eleanor anticipated this exact strategy, and she prepared accordingly. He explained that Eleanor had worked with not just Swiss financial advisors, but also with American attorneys who specialized in protecting international trusts from domestic challenges. She'd structured the trust to comply with both Swiss and American legal requirements, and she'd created multiple layers of documentation that would support her mental competency and clear intentions. "She also included provisions for your legal defense," Robert continued. The trust includes funds specifically designated for protecting the beneficiary against any challenges or legal attacks. She understood that her family might attempt to use the legal system to intimidate you into sharing the inheritance, and she wanted to ensure you'd have the resources to fight back. The idea that Eleanor had even paid for my legal defense felt surreal, like discovering that she'd been orchestrating events from beyond the grave. Her planning had been so comprehensive that she'd anticipated not just what would happen, but how I would need to be protected when it did. Robert recommended that I meet with a criminal defense attorney as a precautionary measure, even though he believed the chances of actual prosecution were minimal. He also suggested that I avoid any contact with my family members while the legal challenges were pending, to prevent any interactions that might be misinterpreted or used against me in court proceedings. The most important thing right now is to let the legal system work, he advised. Eleanor prepared for this battle, and we have every tool we need to win it. But it's going to take time, and it's going to be unpleasant. Your family is going to say things about you that aren't true, and they're going to try to make you doubt your own worthiness. Don't let them succeed. I spent the rest of the morning researching criminal defense attorneys and trying to understand the legal landscape I was now navigating. The complexity was staggering, involving international banking law, estate planning regulations, elder abuse statutes, and criminal procedure rules that I'd never needed to understand before. The internet searches led me down rabbit holes of legal precedents and case studies. Stories of families torn apart by inheritance disputes and beneficiaries who'd been forced to spend years defending gifts from deceased relatives. Some had succeeded in protecting their inheritances, while others had been worn down by legal costs and family pressure until they'd accepted reduced settlements just to end the fighting. Eleanor's provision for my legal defense suddenly made perfect sense. She'd researched these cases too, had understood that the legal system could be used as a weapon against beneficiaries who lacked the resources to fight back. By funding my defense through the trust itself, she'd ensured that I could match my family's legal firepower, regardless of how long the battle continued. My meeting with Marcus that afternoon provided a welcome break from the intensity of legal strategizing. We met at a small cafe near the university campus, the kind of place where graduate students nursed single cups of coffee for hours while writing dissertations and debating philosophy. The normalcy of the setting felt precious after the morning's discussions of international banking regulations and criminal defense strategies. Marcus looked concerned as I approached his table, his usually cheerful expression shadowed by worry. "Sarah, you look exhausted. What's going on with your family situation? And don't tell me it's just normal grief processing, because I've known you for 4 years and you've never looked this stressed." I sat down across from him, grateful for his directness and genuine concern. Marcus had become my closest friend at the library, someone whose company I valued precisely because our relationship was based on shared interests and mutual respect, rather than family obligation or professional networking. "It's complicated," I began, then realized how inadequate that phrase was for describing my current situation. "Eleanor left me some money in her will, and my family is not happy about it." "How much money are we talking about?" Marcus asked, his voice gentle but curious. I hesitated, realizing that this moment would fundamentally change our friendship. Once I told him about the inheritance, he would know that I was wealthy, and that knowledge would inevitably affect how he saw me and interacted with me. Eleanor's warning about surrounding myself with people who'd known me before I had money suddenly felt urgently relevant. "A lot," I said finally. "More than I ever imagined having, and definitely more than my family thinks I deserve." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying my expression with the analytical mind that made him such a good research librarian. "When you say a lot, are we talking about enough to pay off student loans, or enough to buy a house, or enough to never work again?" "The third one," I said quietly, watching his face for signs of how this information might change things between us. His eyebrows rose, but his expression remained warm and concerned, rather than calculating or envious. "Wow. That explains the stress. Sudden wealth can be as traumatic as sudden poverty, especially when family relationships are involved." He paused, considering his words carefully. "How are you handling it?" His response was so perfectly Marcus that I felt tears of relief stinging my eyes. He'd processed the information about my inheritance and immediately focused on my emotional well-being rather than the financial details. This was exactly the kind of person Eleanor had advised me to value, someone whose concern for me transcended monetary considerations. "I'm not sure I am handling it," I admitted. "My family is challenging the inheritance, claiming that I manipulated Eleanor into leaving me the money. They've hired attorneys, and they're threatening criminal charges for elder abuse. It's like suddenly finding myself in the middle of a war. One never wanted to fight." Marcus listened as I explained the legal challenges and the international complications, his expression growing more serious as he understood the scope of what I was facing. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, apparently processing the complexity of my situation. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me," he said finally. "Did you manipulate your grandmother? Did you spend time with her because you were hoping for an inheritance?" The question was direct and potentially offensive, but I could hear the genuine concern in his voice. He was asking not because he doubted me, but because he wanted to understand the truth, so he could offer appropriate support. "No," I said without hesitation. "I visited Eleanor because I enjoyed her company and because she seemed lonely. I never asked about her finances, never inquired about inheritance, and honestly never imagined she had enough money to make inheritance a consideration. I thought she was comfortable but not wealthy." Marcus nodded, apparently satisfied with my answer. "Then you have nothing to feel guilty about. Someone who loved you chose to leave you a gift, and other people are angry because they feel entitled to that gift instead. That's their problem, not yours." His simple framing of the situation felt like a revelation. I'd been so caught up in the legal complexities and family dynamics that I'd lost sight of the fundamental truth. Eleanor had chosen to leave me money because she wanted to, and other people's opinions about that choice didn't change its legitimacy. "The question now," Marcus continued, "is what you're going to do with this gift and how you're going to protect yourself from people who want to take it away from you." We spent the next hour discussing practical strategies for managing the legal challenges and emotional stress of the inheritance dispute. Marcus had a practical mind that complemented his academic interests, and he helped me think through questions I hadn't considered about how to maintain my normal life while dealing with extraordinary circumstances. "You're going to need a support system that's completely separate from your family," he observed. "People who knew you before the money and who will be there regardless of how the legal battles turn out. That's not just emotional support, it's practical protection against isolation and manipulation." His insight reminded me of Eleanor's warnings about how money could reveal people's true motivations and change relationship dynamics. I was already seeing this with my family, but I needed to be prepared for it to affect other relationships as well. As we prepared to leave the cafe, Marcus handed me a small piece of paper with his home phone number written in his careful handwriting. "I know you have my work number and my cell, but I want you to have this too. If you need to talk to someone who doesn't have any financial interest in your situation, call me anytime, day or night." The gesture was small but profoundly meaningful, a reminder that genuine friendship existed separately from financial calculations. Eleanor had been right about the importance of identifying people who valued me for who I was rather than what I had, and Marcus had just proven himself to be exactly that kind of person. Driving home, I felt more grounded than I had since the inheritance revelation. Marcus's straightforward approach to my situation had helped me regain perspective on what was really happening, and what I needed to do to protect myself. The legal battles would continue, but I was beginning to understand that they were ultimately about other people's greed and entitlement, rather than any legitimate questions about Eleanor's wishes or my worthiness. That evening, I received another call from David Kim in Switzerland, this time with updates about the investigation his firm was conducting in response to my family's allegations. Bergman and Associates had reviewed all their documentation regarding Eleanor's mental state and decision-making capacity, and they'd found no evidence to support claims of incompetence or undue influence. "We've also completed our review of all communications between Mrs. Mitchell and potential beneficiaries," David reported. "The records show that she initiated all contact regarding the trust, that she specifically insisted on secrecy to prevent family pressure, and that she repeatedly confirmed her intentions over the 15-year period of the trust's existence." He explained that Swiss banking regulators had established strict protocols for evaluating elder abuse allegations, particularly when they involved international trusts and large sums of money. Eleanor's case met all the regulatory requirements for demonstrating competent decision-making and clear intentions. Most importantly, David continued, we have documentation showing that Mrs. Mitchell specifically anticipated challenges to the trust and took extraordinary measures to protect her chosen beneficiary. She understood that her family might attempt to use legal pressure to force a redistribution of her assets, and she structured the trust to prevent that outcome. The conversation reinforced my growing understanding that Eleanor had been playing a much longer game than anyone had realized. She'd been preparing for this battle for 15 years, building an unassailable legal fortress around her final wishes and ensuring that I would have every tool necessary to defend her gift. There is one thing you should be aware of, David added, his tone becoming more serious. Your family's attorneys have also been making inquiries about your current financial status and spending patterns since learning about the inheritance. They're trying to build a case that you're already treating the money as your own, which they claim supports their theory that you manipulated Mrs. Mitchell with specific financial expectations. The surveillance of my spending habits felt like another invasion of privacy, but I realized it was probably a standard legal strategy in inheritance disputes. My family was trying to find evidence that I'd been expecting Eleanor's money, or that I was behaving in ways that suggested prior knowledge of the inheritance. Fortunately, David continued, our records show that you haven't accessed any of the trust funds yet, and your spending patterns remain consistent with your pre-inheritance lifestyle. This actually supports Mrs. Mitchell's documented observations about your character and motivations. Even my restraint in claiming the inheritance was apparently working in my favor, demonstrating the kind of careful, non-materialistic approach that Eleanor had valued in our relationship. Her documentation had been so thorough that even my current behavior was confirming her 15-year assessment of my character. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on the day's revelations about the scope of Eleanor's planning and the intensity of my family's legal assault. The battle lines were clearly drawn, with international banking regulations and criminal law statutes becoming weapons in a war over money that I'd never asked for or expected. But I was also beginning to understand my own strength in this fight. Eleanor had given me more than money. She'd given me proof of my own worthiness and the legal tools to defend that proof against any challenger. My family could hire expensive attorneys and make criminal accusations, but they couldn't change the fundamental truth that someone who knew me well had chosen to love me extraordinarily. The inheritance was no longer just about money. It had become a validation of everything I'd tried to be as a person, a reward for choosing authenticity over calculation and presence over performance. Eleanor's trust wasn't just financial, it was existential. A statement that my quiet life of library work and Sunday visits had more value than my family's flashy success and social positioning. Tomorrow would bring new legal challenges, and probably new accusations from family members who couldn't understand why their entitled expectations had been disappointed. But tonight, I felt confident that Eleanor had prepared me for whatever was coming, that her 15 years of documentation and international legal planning would protect both her legacy and my future. The Swiss trust documents sat on my kitchen counter like a promise of security and freedom, but they also represented something more important: proof that love could be unconditional, that kindness had measurable value, and that sometimes the people who see us most clearly are the ones who choose to protect us from a world that doesn't always recognize our worth. I was Sarah Mitchell, the chosen beneficiary of someone who'd understood the difference between wealth and worth, and no amount of legal pressure or family manipulation could change that fundamental truth. Eleanor's gift would survive whatever challenges were coming, because she'd built it on a foundation stronger than money, the documented reality of unconditional love. The family dinner invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, hand-delivered by Uncle Tom himself to my apartment complex. Mrs. Garcia intercepted him at the front entrance, her protective instincts apparently triggered by his expensive suit and stern expression. When she knocked on my door to tell me that a well-dressed man was asking for me, I knew exactly who it was before I looked out the window. Tom stood beside his silver Mercedes, checking his watch with the impatience of someone accustomed to having his time respected. His presence in my modest apartment complex felt like an invasion, a breach of the boundary between my quiet life and the family drama that was consuming everything else. I watched him from my kitchen window, noting how he surveyed the building with the critical eye of someone who'd spent decades evaluating real estate values. When I finally went downstairs to meet him, his expression was carefully controlled, the kind of professional neutrality he probably used in difficult business negotiations. He handed me an envelope with my name written in Aunt Linda's careful script, and I could smell her expensive perfume lingering on the paper. "Sarah, I hope you'll consider coming to dinner on Sunday. We need to talk as a family, without lawyers and legal documents complicating things." His voice carried the reasonable tone of someone making a perfectly logical request, but I could see the calculation behind his eyes. "I'm not sure that's a good idea given the current legal situation," I replied, though part of me was curious about what they were planning. "The legal situation exists because we haven't been able to have an honest conversation about Eleanor's intentions and what she really would have wanted for our family." Tom adjusted his tie, a gesture I remembered from childhood whenever he was about to make what he considered an important point. "She loved all of us, Sarah. She wouldn't have wanted her death to tear us apart like this." The manipulation was subtle but unmistakable, designed to make me feel guilty for defending Eleanor's clearly stated wishes. Tom was reframing the inheritance dispute as my fault, rather than the natural consequence of their entitlement and financial desperation. "Eleanor was very clear about her intentions," I said. "She had 15 years to change her mind if she wanted to, and she chose not to. She was also isolated and vulnerable in her final years, spending most of her time with one person who may have unconsciously influenced her thinking." Tom's voice remained reasonable, but the accusation was clear. "I'm not saying you deliberately manipulated her, but elderly people can become confused about family relationships, especially when they're dependent on one person for most of their social interaction." I felt anger rising in my chest, but I forced myself to remain calm. Eleanor wasn't confused about anything. She was sharp and intelligent right up until the end, and she made her decision based on years of observing how different family members treated her. Tom sighed, shaking his head with the kind of disappointed expression he'd used when I was a child and had failed to meet his expectations. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that concerns us, Sarah. Eleanor was never the type of person to play favorites or keep score of family interactions. The woman I knew would have wanted her wealth to benefit everyone equally, not to reward one person while punishing others." His rewriting of Eleanor's character was breathtaking in its dishonesty. I remembered countless family gatherings where Eleanor had made pointed comments about people's motivations and priorities, where she'd expressed frustration with family members who only appeared when they needed something. She'd been observing and judging for decades, but Tom had apparently chosen not to notice. "I'll think about the dinner invitation," I said, taking the envelope but making no commitment to attend. "Please do. And Sarah, remember that family is supposed to be forever. Money comes and goes, but we're all we have left of Eleanor's legacy." Tom climbed back into his Mercedes, leaving me standing in the parking lot with his guilt trip echoing in my ears. Inside the envelope was a formal invitation to Sunday dinner at Tom and Linda's house in Scottsdale, complete with a handwritten note from Linda expressing how much they missed having me at family gatherings. The emotional manipulation was expertly crafted, designed to make me feel like the family outsider who was destroying relationships over money. But I'd been reading Eleanor's journals and letters, documents that revealed a very different perspective on family dynamics. She'd written extensively about the pressure tactics that wealthy families use to maintain control over inheritance decisions, about the way guilt and obligation were weaponized to force compliance with other people's expectations. "The most insidious form of family manipulation," Eleanor had written in one particularly insightful passage, "is the suggestion that defending your own interests somehow violates family loyalty. People who feel entitled to your resources will always frame their demands as being for your own good, or for the good of family unity. They'll make you feel selfish for protecting what someone else chose to give you." Her words felt prophetic as I reread Tom's invitation and considered the family dinner that was clearly designed to pressure me into sharing the inheritance. They were banking on my discomfort with conflict and my desire to maintain family relationships, expecting that emotional manipulation would succeed where legal challenges might fail. That afternoon, I met with Elizabeth Morrison, the criminal defense attorney that Robert Chen had recommended. Her office was in a downtown Phoenix high-rise, decorated with the kind of understated elegance that suggested both success and discretion. Elizabeth herself was a woman in her 50s, with silver hair and the sharp intelligence that came from decades of defending people against accusations they didn't deserve. "Sarah, I've reviewed all the documentation that Robert provided, and I want to assure you that the chances of actual criminal prosecution are extremely minimal," she began, settling behind her desk with a file that contained copies of Eleanor's trust documents and supporting evidence. "But they are threatening criminal charges," I said, still struggling to believe that accepting a gift from my grandmother could somehow be construed as a crime. "They're threatening criminal charges as a negotiation tactic, designed to frighten you into accepting a settlement that would reduce your inheritance and increase theirs." Elizabeth's voice was calm, but firm. "It's a common strategy in estate disputes, particularly when one side feels that the legal facts don't support their position." She explained that elder abuse prosecutions required evidence of actual exploitation or manipulation, proof that the victim had been harmed by the accused person's actions. Eleanor's extensive documentation of her mental competency and clear intentions would make such a prosecution nearly impossible to pursue successfully. "More importantly," Elizabeth continued, "the Swiss banking records and psychological evaluations provide independent verification of your grandmother's decision-making capacity and autonomous choice. No prosecutor would take on a case with this much contradictory evidence, especially when the alleged victim spent years documenting her satisfaction with the accused person's behavior." The legal complexities were reassuring, but I found myself more interested in Elizabeth's assessment of my family's motivations and tactics. She'd handled enough inheritance disputes to recognize the patterns of behavior that emerged when families fought over money. "What you're experiencing is unfortunately quite common," she observed. "Family members who expected to inherit significant wealth often react with desperation when those expectations are disappointed. They'll use every available pressure tactic, including threats of criminal prosecution, social ostracism, and emotional manipulation." "How do people usually handle this kind of pressure?" I asked, thinking about the dinner invitation sitting on my kitchen counter. "The most successful clients are those who establish clear boundaries early and refuse to engage with manipulation tactics. Family members who are willing to threaten criminal prosecution over inheritance disputes have already demonstrated that they don't respect your autonomy or your rights. Trying to negotiate with them usually just encourages more aggressive behavior." Elizabeth's advice aligned with Eleanor's warnings about family pressure and the importance of protecting myself from people who felt entitled to her resources. The dinner invitation was clearly designed to circumvent my legal protections and apply direct emotional pressure in a setting where I'd be outnumbered and surrounded by people questioning my character. "What would you recommend regarding family contact while this is ongoing?" I asked. "Complete communication through attorneys only," Elizabeth replied without hesitation. "Any direct interaction with your family members could be misinterpreted or used against you in legal proceedings. They've made criminal accusations against you, Sarah. They're not your family anymore in any meaningful sense. They're adversaries in a legal dispute." The clinical framing of the situation was both liberating and heartbreaking. I'd been struggling to maintain family relationships while defending Eleanor's gift. But Elizabeth was right that those relationships had been fundamentally altered by my family's decision to attack my character and threaten my freedom. That evening, I called Marcus to discuss the dinner invitation and Elizabeth's recommendations. His response was immediate and unambiguous. "Absolutely not. Don't go to that dinner, don't respond to emotional manipulation, and don't give them any opportunity to pressure you into compromising your inheritance." His voice carried the protective anger of someone who cared about my well-being more than family politics. "But what if they're genuinely trying to find a solution that works for everyone?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Sarah, people who are genuinely interested in fair solutions don't threaten criminal prosecution and hire attorneys to attack your character. They're not looking for compromise, they're looking for capitulation." Marcus paused, apparently choosing his words carefully. "Your grandmother left you that money because she saw something valuable in your character. Don't let people who feel entitled to her resources convince you to doubt her judgment." His framing of the situation helped clarify what was really at stake. This wasn't just about money or family relationships. It was about whether I would honor Eleanor's assessment of my worthiness or allow other people's expectations to override her clearly expressed wishes. I decided not to attend the family dinner, instead spending Sunday afternoon at Papago Park, sitting on the bench where Eleanor and I had shared our last meaningful conversation. The desert landscape felt peaceful and timeless, removed from the legal battles and family manipulation that were dominating my daily life. While I sat thinking about Eleanor's legacy and my responsibilities as her chosen beneficiary, my phone buzzed with increasingly frantic texts from various family members. Linda wanted to know if I was coming to dinner. Jessica demanded to know why I was hiding behind lawyers instead of talking to family. Tom sent a message expressing disappointment in my selfishness and disregard for family unity. The progression of messages revealed the escalating pressure tactics that Elizabeth had warned me about. When reasonable requests didn't work, they moved to guilt trips. When guilt trips didn't work, they moved to accusations and character attacks. The pattern was predictable and manipulative, designed to wear down my resistance through sustained emotional assault. But Eleanor's documentation had prepared me for exactly this scenario. She'd written extensively about the pressure tactics that families use to control inheritance decisions, and she'd specifically warned that people who felt entitled to her money would try to make me doubt my own worthiness and her judgment. Remember, she'd written in one particularly prescient passage that people who truly love you will respect your rights and your boundaries, even when they're disappointed by circumstances they can't control. People who attack your character when they don't get what they want from you were never really on your side to begin with. Monday morning brought news that changed everything about the legal landscape. David Kim called from Switzerland with updates about Bergman and Associates' investigation into my family's allegations, and his voice carried the satisfaction of someone delivering decisive news. Miss Mitchell, I have excellent news. Our investigation has been completed, and we've found not only that all allegations against you are unfounded, but that the evidence actually supports potential counterclaims against the parties making the accusations. He explained that Swiss banking regulators had reviewed every aspect of Eleanor's trust arrangement and had found it to be exemplary in its compliance with international standards for protecting elderly clients from exploitation. More importantly, they'd discovered evidence that my family had been aware of Eleanor's financial arrangements for much longer than they'd claimed. We found records of multiple inquiries about Mrs. Mitchell's international assets, dating back over 3 years. These inquiries came from attorneys and financial advisors representing your uncle and cousin, suggesting that they'd been researching her wealth and making inheritance plans well before her death. The revelation was stunning. While I'd been visiting Eleanor every Sunday without any knowledge of her financial arrangements, Jessica and Tom had been conducting sophisticated research into her international assets and planning their inheritance strategies. Their claims of surprise and ignorance about the trust were completely fabricated. There's more, David continued. We also found evidence that they'd been pressuring Mrs. Mitchell to modify her estate planning in the months before her death. Phone records show multiple calls from family members requesting meetings about, quote, financial planning and, quote, legacy arrangements, all of which she declined. The pattern that emerged from the Swiss investigation was damning. My family had been pursuing Eleanor's money aggressively while she was alive, and when those efforts failed, they'd resorted to legal challenges based on fabricated claims about her mental state and my supposed manipulation. The Swiss authorities are prepared to provide this evidence to American courts if necessary, David concluded. More importantly, the trust funds are now fully available for your use, and we're confident that no legal challenges will succeed given the strength of our documentation. The call ended my period of uncertainty and defensive positioning. I was no longer just the inheritor of Eleanor's money. I was the vindicated beneficiary of someone who'd protected me from family members whose behavior had been even worse than she'd anticipated. That afternoon, I met with Robert Chen to discuss the Swiss findings and their implications for the ongoing legal battles. His office felt different now, less like a defensive fortress and more like a command center where we were planning our counterattack. Sarah, this evidence changes everything, he said, spreading the Swiss documentation across his conference table. Your family's credibility has been completely destroyed, and we now have grounds to pursue sanctions against their attorneys for filing frivolous claims based on knowingly false information. The legal momentum had shifted decisively in my favor, but more importantly, the truth about my family's motivations and behavior had been conclusively established. Eleanor's trust hadn't just protected her money, it had exposed the people who felt entitled to it and revealed their willingness to lie and manipulate to get what they wanted. What happens now? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Now we go on offense, Robert replied with the satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. We have enough evidence to not only defend the trust, but to potentially pursue claims for defamation, harassment, and abuse of legal process. Your family chose to make this a war, and we're going to show them what happens when they attack someone who was properly prepared for battle. The transformation from defensive uncertainty to offensive confidence felt liberating. Eleanor had given me more than money. She'd given me the tools to defeat people who'd underestimated both her planning and my worthiness. The inheritance was secure, my character was vindicated, and my family's true nature had been exposed for all to see. As I left Robert's office that afternoon, I realized that Eleanor's gift had accomplished exactly what she'd intended. It had identified the people who truly cared about me versus those who only cared about her resources. And it had given me the strength and resources to protect myself from those who would exploit family relationships for financial gain. The Swiss trust was no longer just an inheritance. It was proof that love could be unconditional, that character had measurable value, and that sometimes the people who see us most clearly are the ones who choose to arm us for battles we didn't know we'd have to fight. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.